Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Joe Valachi, the man who rose through the shadows of the underworld and later became the first to break the code of silence that held the Mafia together. Before we begin, make sure to like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes. And don't forget to share your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Joe Valachi guide you into the night. The old man lay awake on the narrow prison bunk, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling. Night checks had passed, the corridor was quiet, and the only sounds were distant footsteps and the soft hum of pipes in the walls. He turned on his side, then on his back again, but sleep would not come. Too many faces floated in the darkness behind his eyes. Too many deals, too many hurried whispers, too many doors that had opened for him and then slammed shut. He knew people out there said his name now like a story around a table. Joe Valachi. Some said he was a traitor. Others called him a witness. Reporters used words like historic, first man to break the code. To him, those labels didn't mean much. When the cell door closed, what mattered was simpler. How had a hungry boy from East Harlem ended up here, an old man in a gray uniform, about to tell the world secrets that once could have cost him his life? He could still feel the heat of the television lights from that hearing room, the way the cameras stared without blinking. Senators leaned forward, pens ready. He had sat there, a small figure in a plain suit, and tried to explain an invisible world. Names, families, ceremonies, rules. The thing people called the Mafia, the thing he had spent most of his life serving, suddenly spoken out loud. There was no way to undo it. Yet the road to that table had started long before anyone knew what a Valachi hearing was. It had started in cramped rooms, cold winters, and the thin walls of a tenement where dreams were small and chances even smaller. Long before the microphones and the headlines, there was just a boy, a neighborhood, and the feeling that the law was something that happened to other people, never for them. That sense, more than any oath, pulled him step by step into the life he would spend his last years describing. He was born Giuseppe Valachi on a September day in 1903, in a block of East Harlem where Italian was heard more often than English. His parents had crossed the ocean from southern Italy with almost nothing. What they carried were habits, long workdays, simple food, and the hope that in this new place their children might struggle a little less than they had. They lived in a crowded building where walls were thin and winters cruel. Coal cost money they rarely had. Some nights the only warmth came from bodies pressed close under worn blankets. His father worked on construction sites when there was work. When there wasn't, he waited with other men on street corners, watching wagons and later trucks roll by, trying not to show the worry in his eyes. His mother sewed and mended, cooked pots of soup that could stretch to feed many mouths. School never felt like it belonged to Joe. English words tangled his tongue, teachers scolded him for being restless, and he felt small and foolish while other kids seemed to move ahead. By the time he reached 5th grade, the pressure at home was clear. There were too many mouths, not enough pay envelopes. One day he simply stopped going. No long talk, no family meeting. Work felt more urgent than spelling lessons that didn't put food on the table. He sold newspapers, shined shoes, carried buckets, did whatever paid a few cents. On the corners he noticed a different kind of man. Sharp suits, polished shoes, hair slicked back. They spoke with confidence. Their pockets always seemed full, and shopkeepers treated them with nervous respect. As a boy, he didn't know words like racketeer or enforcer. He just saw that the men who gave orders, not the ones who bent their backs, looked better fed. The streets taught faster than any classroom. Joe watched older boys hustle, watched how they darted between wagons to swipe coal, how they slipped fruit into their coats from open barrels while the grocer's back was turned. At first, he just watched. Hunger, though, is a patient teacher. One cold day, when his hands ached from shining shoes and he had almost nothing to show for it, he followed their example. A quick hand, a stolen apple, A wild sprint down the block with his heart racing. The apple tasted better than any he remembered, flavored with fear and relief. Petty theft became less shocking each time. A bit of coal here, a loaf of bread there, items lifted from pushcarts. Sometimes he was caught and yelled at, cuffed by an angry vendor, chased down the street. But no one brought the police over such small things. And he learned where the line usually Saturday. In those years, gambling was everywhere, even if it hid in plain sight. Men would crowd around a corner to talk about the numbers. Small bets on daily drawings that offered a thin hope of escape. Joe became a runner before he understood the math behind it. Someone would hand him slips of paper, another man would be waiting on another block, and he would pass them along for a few coins. He didn't ask many questions. The more he ran, the more faces he learned, the more he understood that some men's names carried weight. Then came Prohibition, that big national rule that said alcohol was no longer allowed. In his neighborhood, it didn't make streets calmer. It made them busier. Bottles still flowed, just in different ways. Bars became quiet rooms behind doors that locked. New money appeared for those willing to move crates at night or stand watch at alley mouths. For a boy already used to bending rules, this opened fresh paths. He stood outside back doors and whistled if he saw uniforms. He rode on trucks that smelled like fermenting grapes and sharp spirits. He saw cash pass hands, envelopes disappear into pockets. The connection between risk and reward became clear. Honest work kept a family just above disaster. The other kind, dangerous and secret, could make a man suddenly comfortable. By his late teens, Joe drifted into a small gang of neighborhood youths. They were not yet part of any grand organization. They were just boys with quick feet, quick tempers, and a taste for easy scores. They stole from parked cars, snatched packages from loading docks, and sometimes slipped into dark stairwells in buildings that were supposed to be locked for the night. One job changed the scale of things. They found a way into a storage room, packed with bolts of cloth and boxes of shoes. The older boy leading them explained how they could load a wagon in minutes, sell the goods to a fence, and walk away with more money in one night than in months of shining shoes. It worked. That thrill of walking down the street with pockets heavy and no one suspecting what they had just done sank deep into Joe's mind. The law, inevitably, caught up. In 1921, after a string of thefts, he was arrested for grand larceny related to stolen goods and cars. This time, it wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was court, a judge, and a real sentence. He was sent to Sing Sing, the prison that boys in the neighborhood spoke of in low voices. Prison hardened him, but not in the way some imagine. There were no dramatic fights written in legend. Instead, there was boredom, routine, and the quiet realization that he was now fully marked as a criminal. Among the men inside were robbers, burglars, gang members tied to bigger outfits. They swapped stories in the yard and in work details. They talked about who controlled which streets, which bosses had risen and fallen, which names to remember. One theme ran through many of those talks. There were disorganized crooks, and there were men in families who moved in more controlled lines. The latter served powerful bosses, answered to clear chains of command, and followed rules that, strange as it sounded, gave shape to their crimes. Joe listened closely. For someone who had grown up feeling like life tossed him around at random, the idea of structure, even in wrongdoing, had its appeal. He learned small lessons: how to keep his mouth shut when asked direct questions, how not to boast, how to sense which inmates had real connections outside. He left Sing Sing around 18 months later, with more knowledge, a roughened heart, and no clear path back to honest work. Employers weren't eager to hire an ex-convict with little schooling and a record for stealing. Back in East Harlem, the world of his childhood felt smaller. Some old friends tried to go straight. Others had moved deeper into crime. Joe chose the road he already knew. Over time, he fell in with a group that became known for how fast they could pull off robberies. They focused on trucks and warehouses, slipping in and out so swiftly that people later joked you could set a watch by them. People began calling them Minutemen, not because of any Patriot story, but because their jobs lasted only minutes. They would trail delivery trucks, learn routes, and pick spots where a driver might pause. At the right moment, they moved in, sometimes with a shove or a threat, but avoiding needless harm. Their aim was simple: grab goods, disappear, sell to fences who didn't care about origins, repeat. The items varied: cloth, food, manufactured products, but the pattern held. With each success, Joe's confidence grew. He took pride in being a reliable driver, someone who could speed away without crashing, someone calm under pressure. Yet this life had limits. They were still freelancers, always at risk from police crackdowns or from bumping into more serious underworld figures whose territory they might unknowingly cross. One meeting shifted his path again. Through acquaintances, some say through a man named Dominic Petrilli. Others through different small-time organizers, he came into contact with people tied to a more established group based in the Bronx, led by a boss named Gaetano, Tommy Reyna. Reyna controlled lucrative rackets, including ice distribution and gambling, and answered to a broader network of Italian-American underworld figures. To Joe, this was a step up from corner gangs and ad hoc crews. These men operated with discipline. They didn't talk loudly in bars about their scores. They spoke quietly, used middlemen, and preferred loyal workers over flashy show-offs. Around this time, another important thread entered Joe's story. He met a young woman named Carmela, a relative of Reyna's people. She brought a gentler light into his life. Sunday dinners, family gatherings, the warmth of a home where laughter wasn't always edged with tension. Getting close to her also drew him nearer to Reyna's circle. Marriage to Carmela in the late 1922 tied him by blood and affection to that world. With those ties came different work. Instead of random truck robberies, Joe began helping in more organized ventures. He collected money from small gambling spots that paid a portion of their earnings for protection. He ran errands tied to numbers games, carrying cash, messages, and sometimes subtle warnings on behalf of his superiors. When necessary, he joined others in intimidating those who refused to pay what Reyna's men claimed was owed. Violence was part of that life, though it was not always dramatic. A beating in an alley, a broken window to send a message, the quiet pressure of several men standing too close to a shopkeeper who tried to resist. Joe's role in such acts varied, but he was no stranger to them, yet he rarely spoke later in vivid detail about particular incidents from these early years. Instead, he described a pattern of doing what he was told, following instructions from men higher up. By the end of the 1922, the landscape of Italian-American organized crime in New York was shifting dramatically. Powerful bosses eyed each other with suspicion. Lines of loyalty began to crack, and whispers of an approaching conflict rode through the cafes and social clubs. Joe, at the lower levels, could sense that something large was brewing, even if he didn't yet grasp all the names and alliances. He had moved from a hungry boy snatching apples to a dependable soldier in waiting, tied by marriage and work to an emerging power structure. Around him, older men spoke of rival bosses Masseria, Maranzano, Reyna in tones that suggested that the next few years would be dangerous for anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time. Late at night, as he walked home through streets lit by dim lamps and neon signs, he might pass the corners where he once shined shoes or waited for odd jobs. Those memories sat beside the reality that now, if a boy looked his way, it might be with the same mixture of fear and admiration he had once felt for older toughs. Without planning it, he had become one of them. Ahead lay war between factions, secret meetings, ceremonies that would bind him formally to a crime family, and decisions that would echo all the way to that stark hearing room decades later. For the moment, though, he was still climbing, still thinking mainly of survival, money, and respect, unaware of how far the path would carry him and how steep the price would be when the bill finally came due. The tension in New York's Italian neighborhoods tightened slowly, like a rope pulled from both ends by hands you couldn't see. People like Joe felt it in small ways first. Whispers stopped when a stranger entered a cafe. Men who once sat together now held separate tables. A few faces vanished without much talk. Names of powerful figures began to circle more often. Joe Masseria on one side, Salvatore Maranzano on the other, old country rivals now fighting for control of the city's underworld. Joe worked under Gaetano Reyna's umbrella in the Bronx. Reyna was calm, steady, known for keeping his men busy and his conflicts limited. Joe collected money from gambling spots, made deliveries, and helped ensure that people paid what Reyna's organization demanded. He liked that there were limits. Rules existed, even in crime. Children were left out, neighborhoods were kept relatively calm, and trouble with the police was avoided when possible. Behind the scenes, though, Reina stepped into a dangerous game. Officially, he lined up with Mafia. Quietly, he leaned toward Maranzano. In that hidden world, sitting on two chairs rarely lasted long. In 1930, Reina was lured to what he thought was a friendly meeting in the Bronx and was shot dead in his car. Later accounts pointed to men loyal to Mafia, acting on advice from key aides, as responsible. For Joe, Reina's death was not only the loss of a boss, it was a moment when the ground seemed to shift under his feet. He had tied himself to Reina through marriage and work. Now the man at the center of that web was gone. Rumors spread quickly. Some said more killings were coming. Others advised lying low. Joe did what he had always done. He stayed close to his crew, listened more than he spoke, and tried to read which way the wind was blowing. Reina's organization faltered. A replacement, first one man then another, took over and then met sudden ends. The old structure came apart under pressure from Masseria's side and the rising influence of Maranzano's followers. Joe, like many of Reina's workers, drifted toward a crew aligned firmly with Maranzano. They valued men who showed up on time, kept quiet, and didn't crack when things went wrong. Joe fit that mold. The conflict that followed became known later as the Castellamares War. For Joe, it was not a grand title. It was a series of assignments, warnings, and nights spent watching doorways. Street corners turned tense. Certain restaurants hosted only one faction or the other. A wrong step into the wrong bar could turn fatal. The killings that marked this struggle rarely looked dramatic from the sidewalk. Sudden shots in the street, ambushes near parked cars, bodies found in quiet apartments. Joe never tried to exaggerate his importance. He was not a strategist, not seated at the big tables where alliances were drawn. His value lay in doing what he was told, driving, scouting, bringing men to and from locations, handling smaller enforcement tasks. He took part in planned attacks that led to injuries and deaths of rivals, though he seldom gave detailed descriptions of those acts later. What he did emphasize was the sense of constant pressure. Each time he left home, he knew some people did not expect to live through the year. In that environment, teamwork and silence were not just rules. They were survival skills. As the war dragged on into 1931, the tide turned against Mafia. Defections, undercover deals, and changing loyalties wore his side down. A pivotal moment came when key younger figures, most notably Charles "Lucky" Luciano, shifted support, cutting their ties to Mafia and striking arrangements that would reshape the underworld. Mafia was killed in a Coney Island restaurant in a perfectly timed attack. Joe was not involved in that particular hit, but he knew the message it sent. No boss was untouchable. Maranzano emerged as victor and proclaimed himself the top authority over Italian-American crime in the United States. He reorganized the surviving outfits into structured groups that would later be called families, each with its own boss, underboss, advisors, and crews. Joe, by then trusted as a dependable worker on Maranzano's side, became attached more closely to a Bronx-based group that later fell under the leadership of Joseph Bonanno. For a short period, Maranzano held grand plans. He liked ceremony, tradition, titles drawn from Roman history. He also made a dangerous choice. He began quietly preparing to remove Luciano and other ambitious younger leaders. They, quicker at reading danger than he expected, moved first. In September 1931, Maranzano was killed in his office by men posing as government agents. Once again, Joe was not present at the scene, but news of the event traveled fast through their circles. Another supreme leader gone. Another sudden shift. In the months that followed, the shape of organized crime in New York settled into the form that would last for decades. Several major families, each autonomous in its affairs, but expected to coordinate on larger matters through a secret body, often referred to later as the Commission. Joe's path narrowed within that new order. He aligned under the group led by Joseph Bonanno, a man younger than some of the old bosses, careful and deeply tied to his Castellamares roots. Sometime in the early 1932 sources disagree on the exact year, Joe underwent the formal ceremony that changed him from a useful associate into a full member of the organization. He later described that event in careful detail for investigators. It took place in a private setting, likely an apartment or back room, away from prying eyes. Only trusted figures were present. The ritual stressed loyalty, secrecy, and obedience. A small cut was made on his finger, and a holy image was placed in his hand. As the picture burned, he was told that if he broke the oath of silence, his fate should be like that of the burning image. He pledged loyalty to the family above all else, promising to assist fellow members, to follow orders from superiors, and never to cooperate with law enforcement against his associates. Those words would hang over every decision he made for the next 3 decades. Walking out after that ceremony, Joe felt that he had finally reached the inner circle he had watched from a distance in his youth. To him, this meant protection, status, and a sense of belonging. On the street, being straightened out, as some called it, carried weight. Shopkeepers treated him with extra caution. Other criminals respected his connections, and younger men looked at him with the same wary admiration he had once given older toughs. With membership came steady work. His activities were varied, but followed the main lines of family business. He helped supervise illegal gambling operations, including card games and betting rooms, where wagers on horse races and sports changed hands. He collected debts from people who borrowed money at high interest, a practice widely known then as loan sharking. When borrowers failed to pay, Joe applied pressure. Visits at inconvenient hours, firm reminders, sometimes a beating carried out with enough force to send a message but avoid headlines. He also took part in protection schemes. Certain businesses paid the family a regular fee in exchange for security. Ostensibly, this meant defense from thieves or troublemakers. In practice, the main threat often came from the very people demanding payment. Joe would walk into shops, speak politely but firmly, and make sure owners understood that falling behind on payments was not an option. Over time, narcotics entered the picture. Officially, leaders in his world claimed to oppose drug trafficking. The trade brought increased law enforcement attention and carried heavier sentences. Publicly, older bosses denounced involvement, warning members that dealing in drugs without permission could bring harsh internal punishment. In reality, some allowed limited participation if it brought profit and stayed discreet. Joe became involved in these operations at a low level at first, helping to move packages, coordinate meetings, and transport funds. He did not see himself as a major player in that field, but his name later appeared on federal indictments tied to narcotics distribution. He defended his actions by saying that powerful men above him had approved or even instructed such activity, though, of course, they rarely left clear evidence of their involvement. Throughout the 1,930 seconds, Joe's day-to-day life balanced crime and family. He and Carmela raised children, trying to give them a stable home. To neighbors, they looked like many immigrant households. Relatives visiting on weekends, large meals, music and laughter behind lace curtains. Joe limited how much his family knew about his work. He left home early, returned late, often with simple explanations about dealing in real estate or trucking or other vague businesses. Like many wives in similar situations, Carmela likely knew more than he admitted but chose not to press. Law enforcement pressure ebbed and flowed. Small arrests came now and then: loitering, disorderly conduct, minor gambling charges, but most of his more serious work stayed hidden. Police often understood that certain neighborhoods were effectively under the watch of specific groups. Sometimes officers took bribes to look the other way. Other times, they focused on keeping violence from spilling into public view. Rather than dismantling structures they only partly understood. The unwritten code of his world sorted problems into categories. Disputes inside the family were handled internally by higher-ranked members. Conflicts with other families could escalate to committees of bosses. Killing someone was never supposed to be casual. It required approval at levels above ordinary soldiers. Joe followed those rules. More than once, he was involved in targeted actions against individuals marked as dangerous to the organization: informants, rivals, or men whose misbehavior had crossed lines drawn by leadership. He did not dramatize these events when later testifying. He spoke of them as assignments carried out under orders, done because refusal could have meant death. His view of law and morality grew more warped as the years passed. He saw government as something distant that punished or ignored, never helped. In his mind, his loyalty was to the men he worked with daily, not to a country that had offered little when he was young and poor. Mixed into this, though, was real affection for his children and genuine pride in providing for them. He wanted them to dress well, attend school, and avoid the hunger he had known. That personal goal made it easier, he said later, to justify almost anything he did to gather money, as long as he believed he was not harming innocent people more than the hard world already did. By the late 1932, Joe had become what bosses called a good soldier. He did not drink heavily, did not take foolish chances, did not draw attention by flashy spending. He lived in modest apartments, dressed decently but not extravagantly, and preferred neighborhood restaurants to nightclubs where reporters sometimes lurked. Supervisors appreciated that reliability. When they needed someone dependable to watch a location, pick up cash, or accompany a more senior figure, his name came up often. Events beyond his street corner also shaped his environment. The Great Depression hit the country hard, throwing millions out of work. In poor communities, this meant more men willing to gamble in hopes of quick gains, more shopkeepers vulnerable to pressure, and more desperate souls drawn into schemes that promised steady pay, even if the job was illegal. For organized crime families, this period brought hardship, but also opportunities. Illegal gambling thrived. High-interest lending to business owners, whose banks had failed, became more common. Then, in 1939, war broke out in Europe. Within a couple of years, the United States would enter, drawing thousands of young men into the military. Some members and associates of Joe's world were drafted or enlisted. Others found military contracts to be profitable targets for fraud and theft. Rumors circulated that certain mob figures cooperated with government agencies during the war, offering help in keeping docks free of sabotage in exchange for lighter treatment in other matters. Those arrangements took place above Joe's level. He continued doing much the same kind of work, enforcing debts, watching club doors, and handling gambling operations that stayed open, even when the rest of the world seemed to change. By the time the 1940 seconds began, Joe had spent nearly 2 decades inside the criminal underworld in one form or another. From petty theft to organized extortion, from tricky truck robberies to more structured family-approved operations, he had moved steadily upward, though never reaching the highest ranks. He had survived one internal war, watched bosses rise and fall, and sworn an oath that, in his mind, bound him as tightly as any law written on paper. What he did not yet realize was that his world, built on omerta and closed doors, would eventually be dragged into the open. For now, he simply kept moving along the courses assigned to him, convinced that loyalty and silence would be enough to protect him from both outside forces and dangers inside his own circle. By the time the Second World War reached America, Joe had been in the life long enough that very little surprised him. Street corners changed, bosses' names changed, but the rhythms of his days stayed much the same. He woke early, left his apartment without much fuss, and moved through a circuit of cafes, candy stores, barbershops, and back rooms where envelopes changed hands and quiet words carried more weight than any official notice. In those years, his crew operated under the powerful organization that, on the street, people still called the Luciano family, even after Lucky Luciano himself had been sent to prison and then deported. The men above Joe were seasoned figures who had lived through the Castellamarese War, adjusted to the new rules, and now tried to keep disputes from spilling into the open. To the outside world, they were businessmen. To Joe and his peers, they were absolute authority. War brought rationing, shortages, and new chances to make money. Some people in his world got involved in black market deals, meat, sugar, gasoline, but Joe mostly stayed with what he knew best: gambling, high-interest loans, and street enforcement. He supervised small betting operations that took wagers on horses and sporting events. Runners collected money from customers in bars, candy stores, and social clubs. Joe oversaw the intake and payout, made sure the percentages for the family were correct, and settled arguments when someone claimed a bet had been recorded wrong. He liked that kind of work. It required attention, patience, and a calm attitude when gamblers got loud. Violence hovered in the background, but wasn't always needed. Most customers understood the unspoken rules. If they delayed paying, he might first try a friendly visit, a talk over coffee. Only if that failed would he bring along 2 men whose silent presence made his point clearer than any speech. At home, life looked almost ordinary. Joe and Carmela had children to worry about now, schoolwork to check, shoes to buy. They moved to better apartments as his earnings grew. Never luxurious places, but cleaner, more comfortable, with a bit of space between neighbors' walls. On Sundays, relatives gathered around long tables. Food appeared in endless dishes. Kids ran between adults' legs while older men argued about baseball, politics, and memories of villages most of the younger generation had never seen. Joe tried to keep his work life and home life separate. He rarely brought associates to his apartment. He minded his language in front of his children, dressed in simple clothes around the house, and let his wife handle most dealings with teachers and neighbors. Yet even in those moments of normality, the world he served was never far away. A phone call could pull him out in the middle of dinner. A knock on the door after midnight could mean someone needed a driver, a lookout, or just a reliable face at a tense sit-down. During the early 1940 seconds, the official line inside his circle was that narcotics were forbidden. Older bosses repeated it often. Drugs brought long prison terms, angry headlines, and unpredictable partners. Anyone caught dealing without permission faced harsh internal punishment. That was the story. Reality wasn't that simple. Heroin and other drugs moved through the city in quiet channels, and pieces of the profit touched people in many levels of the organization. Joe did not see himself as a drug dealer. His main income still came from gambling and loans. But he came to know men who handled shipments, and he carried messages or money connected to those operations when ordered. He treated those tasks like any other assignment, not as a special category. Later, in court, this would be used against him when prosecutors painted him as deeply involved in narcotics networks. Law enforcement attention increased as the decade went on. The old belief that authorities didn't understand how things were structured started to crack. Detectives learned names, studied patterns, and began to recognize that scattered crimes were linked to tightly knit groups. Joe earned a reputation in police circles as a consistent presence in East Harlem and the Bronx underworld. Arrest reports listed him now and then for gambling, disorderly conduct, or loitering. But penalties were usually small. Fines, short county jail stays, occasional suspended sentences. Nothing yet threatened to take years from his life. After the war, a new wave of prosperity washed over the country. Returning soldiers bought houses, raised families, and filled diners and movie theaters. For Joe's world, the boom meant more money available for betting and more businesses ripe for protection. Neighborhood bars, jukebox routes, cigarette machines, and vending contracts all became arenas where the family expected a share. Joe expanded into some of these areas. He had interests in jukebox and vending machine routes, sometimes in partnership with others in his crew. A bar owner who wanted the most popular machine in the corner or the right cigarette brands on offer often found that the easiest way was to deal with men like Joe. He presented his proposals as helpful arrangements. The machines would bring customers. Any troublemakers would be handled quietly. Everyone would profit. If a bar owner hesitated, a few broken bottles or a fight that never quite got solved might tip the balance. Gambling remained his steady base, though. He developed a fondness for the racetrack himself, and this became one of the more destructive patterns in his life. Joe later described himself as a poor bettor, someone who could collect from others but rarely walked away from his own wagers ahead. He chased wins, tried to analyze horses and odds, yet usually ended the day lighter than he arrived. At first, it was just spending his own shares. Over time, the habit pushed him into debt. Being in debt in his world was dangerous, even for a soldier. Nobody wanted to press him as hard as they might a stranger. But money flowed upward, and if he didn't meet obligations, those above him grew impatient. To catch up, he took on more work, some of it riskier. He agreed to back certain gambling ventures, to move larger sums, to handle collections for other people's loans. It became a cycle. Earn, gamble, lose, scramble to earn more. In the late 1940 seconds and early 1950 seconds, public awareness of organized crime jumped sharply. Senate hearings led by Estes Kefauver paraded famous and not so favor assevations figures across television screens. Americans who had never heard words like syndicate or family now watched tough-looking men in dark suits invoke the Fifth Amendment again and again. Joe was not called in those early hearings, but he watched the coverage with a mix of curiosity and unease. He saw faces he recognized: bosses, bookmakers, union leaders, and realized how much information law enforcement had slowly gathered. Inside his family, leadership changed again. Luciano, though still a respected name in exile, no longer handled daily affairs. Frank Costello, with his smooth manners and political connections, guided much of the organization's activity for a period. Joe respected Costello from afar. To soldiers like him, Costello represented a version of success. Influence without chaos, earnings without constant bloodshed. Under Costello, gambling and business infiltration flourished, while open conflict with rivals was kept low. That balance began to tip when Vito Genovese, a man with a far rougher reputation, returned to the American stage. Genovese had spent years away, tangled in his own legal troubles, but slowly rebuilt his power. By the mid-1952s, tension between Costello and Genovese stiffened. Joe, as a soldier down the ladder, heard rumors long before anything appeared in newspapers. Men spoke in lowered voices about meetings, grudges, and the possibility that Costello might be forced aside. In 1957, Costello was shot outside his apartment building in Manhattan. He survived, but the message rang clear. Whoever wanted him out was willing to push hard. Shortly afterward, he stepped back from leadership, and Genovese moved to claim control. For Joe and others like him, this meant adjusting their loyalties to the new center of gravity. Oaths did not change, but the name at the top of the structure did. He now answered, through his immediate superiors, to the man the world would call the boss of the Genovese family. Genovese craved recognition as the most powerful figure in the American underworld. That hunger for status led to a gathering that would, unintentionally, expose more about their world than any man there intended. In November 1957, a meeting was called at the rural home of a trusted associate near Appalachian, New York. The idea was to host leaders and representatives from across the country to discuss business, settle disputes, and set policies in private. Joe traveled upstate as part of the New York contingent. To him, it was another duty, an obligation that came with his position. The house sat on a large property with a long driveway and open fields. Expensive cars parked outside, more than the little town had ever seen in one place. Inside, men greeted one another with hugs and handshakes. Some reunited after years, others meeting for the first time. Plans were still being laid out when things went wrong. State troopers in the area had grown suspicious of the unusual traffic and the many out-of-state license plates. Soon, law enforcement closed in on the property. Word spread inside the house that police were outside. Panic followed. Men spilled out doors and windows, running across lawns and into nearby woods, trying to escape notice. Joe joined the scramble, darting through brush, his heart pounding as sirens wailed. Many were caught, including him. Troopers rounded up confused, sweating men in suits who looked wildly out of place in the muddy fields. At the station, names and addresses were taken. Most of the men, including Joe, faced only minor charges, such as disorderly conduct. Yet the greater damage had already been done. Newspapers soon carried photographs and lists. Dozens of known and suspected underworld figures gathered at one location. For years, officials had been told there was no nationwide organization. Now this scene made such denials hard to maintain. For Joe personally, Appalachian was a warning sign. It showed that even careful plans could go sideways, that rural seclusion did not guarantee safety, and that law enforcement had started to connect dots across regions. Investigations intensified after the meeting. Grand juries called witnesses. Agents compiled thicker files. Many of the men listed in the Appalachian reports found themselves watched more closely. Around this same period, Joe's debts and need for steady income drew him further into narcotics activity than he had ever expected. Heroin profits were enormous compared to ordinary gambling or loans. Rings linked suppliers overseas with distributors in American cities. Some bosses still preached against involvement, but others, including according to later testimony people tied to Genovese's circle, secretly encouraged selected men to take part. The logic was simple. As long as someone else took the greatest risk, those at the top could enjoy the rewards with some distance. Joe was not a kingpin. He moved money, relayed orders, and sometimes helped arrange safe locations where contacts could meet. Even at that level, though, he stepped into far more dangerous territory than he had known with card games and bookmakers. Federal agents targeted narcotics with special focus. Informants, wiretaps, and undercover operations all zeroed in on the trade. In 1959, the pressure finally caught up with him. A sweeping federal indictment charged more than 24 men, including Joe, with conspiracy to violate narcotics laws. The case rested on informers, surveillance, and seized drugs tied by prosecutors to the network they said his group helped run. For the first time since his young years in Sing Sing, he faced the real possibility of a long stretch behind bars. His first trial ended without a verdict. Jurors could not agree on whether the evidence proved his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For a moment, Joe allowed himself to hope that the case might fall apart, but prosecutors were determined. A second trial followed. This time, the government presented its case with greater care, shoring up weaknesses, pressing witnesses harder. The jury found him guilty. In 1960, Joe received a 15-year federal sentence for narcotics conspiracy. He was in his mid-50s, no longer a young man who could shrug off years as easily. When the judge pronounced the term, he felt a weight he hadn't known even in his early stint. He thought of his wife, his children now grown or nearly grown, the years they would spend visiting him through thick glass if they chose to visit at all. Still, decades of conditioning kept his outward reaction calm. He did not plead publicly for mercy. Inside, he told himself that he was a soldier paying a price that, in his world, came with the territory. He was sent first to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, a massive complex known to underworld figures from across the country. Steel corridors, clanging gates, the steady routine of counts and work details, these replaced the cafes and corner tables of New York. Yet even there, his old world followed him. Atlanta housed more than a few men tied to organized crime. Among them was Genovese himself, convicted in his own narcotics case and now an inmate like any other, at least on paper. To Joe, that shared location at first seemed almost like a form of protection. If his boss was in the same institution, surely the line of loyalty still meant something. He expected that, as long as he kept his head down, did his time without complaining, and followed the old code, he would eventually walk out, older but still breathing, with some respect left attached to his name. He couldn't yet know that within those same walls a chain of suspicion and fear would begin, one that would make him believe his own people wanted him dead. Nor could he foresee that, to save himself, he would break the most sacred rule he had sworn to uphold, and in doing so, drag the hidden structure of American organized crime into the full light of government hearings and television cameras. For the moment, as he lay on his bunk in Atlanta listening to the echo of doors and the murmurs of other inmates, he still believed in silence. He still believed that his greatest danger came from guards or hostile prisoners, not from the very empire he had served so faithfully for most of his life. In Atlanta, the walls felt thicker than in any place Joe had been before. The prison sprawled like a stone city, with long, echoing corridors, barred galleries stacked 3 and 4 tiers high, and a constant metallic clatter that reminded every man he wasn't going anywhere. Yet even in that concrete maze, familiar patterns from the street emerged. Prison yards divided along lines of race, region, and background. Card games appeared, quiet trades were arranged, favors were granted and repaid. The world he had served on the outside had a kind of shadow version on the inside. When he first walked onto the Atlanta yard, word spread quickly that he was there. Men who knew his face nodded. Others studied him from a distance. Before long, he learned what mattered most. The same organization he had served in New York had a presence here too, and the man at the top of that pyramid was confined in the same place. Genovese moved through the institution with an air that said his status hadn't vanished with his freedom. Officially, he was just another inmate. Unofficially, other prisoners deferred to him, and guards recognized that certain disputes calmed faster if they quietly took his preferences into account. To Joe, seeing his boss behind bars was unsettling. It underlined how far law enforcement had come. Years earlier, higher-ranking figures rarely saw the inside of a cell. Now one of the most feared names in their world stood in the chow line like everyone else. At first, Genovese treated Joe cordially. They spoke briefly in the yard, shared a few words about home, the case, the way federal agents had built their prosecutions. Joe still saw himself as a loyal soldier. He had gone through 2 trials, held firm, accepted his sentence without accusing anyone above him. He believed that counted for something. Over time, though, an uneasiness settled over their interactions. Genovese had been convicted in a narcotics case built partly on informers and undercover agents. Somewhere, someone had talked. In the hierarchy they lived by, Betrayal was worse than any other crime. Suspicion floated like smoke, drifting toward various names. Joe felt some of that smoke curling around him. According to his later account, small signs changed first. A greeting from Genovese that once felt warm now seemed cooler. Men who usually joined him at a table in the yard began standing farther away, speaking in clusters where conversations stopped as he approached. None of this proved anything, but in a closed world where rumors could be deadly, it was enough to keep him awake at night. One day, in the prison yard, Genovese leaned in and gave Joe a kiss on the cheek. On the surface, it looked like a friendly gesture from a boss toward a longtime subordinate. To Joe, it landed like a bolt. In his world, such a kiss could mean more than affection. Quietly, he had heard that a kiss like that, given in a certain way at a certain moment, could be a signal, a mark placed on someone who had been judged guilty, someone who would soon be punished. Later, two prisoners pulled him aside. They were connected people, men whose words carried weight. They warned him that there was a price on his head, a contract said to be approved by Genovese himself. The figure quoted hundreds of thousands of dollars sounded enormous. True or exaggerated, it hammered home one message. Someone in authority wanted him gone. Once that idea took root, fear colored everything. Meals became a source of anxiety. In the chow hall, he watched who passed food to whom, who lingered near his table. One day, convinced his tray might be tampered with, he quietly switched it with another prisoner's. When he later heard that the other man fell sharply ill, his conviction deepened that someone was trying to reach him even inside the structured routines of the prison. Reality and imagination mixed. Maybe someone had tried to poison him. Maybe the illness was coincidence. In that environment, though, coincidences were a luxury he didn't feel he could afford. He began walking the yard with his back to walls whenever possible, avoiding certain groups, studying faces for any hint of threat. No one overtly confronted him. That, in some ways, frightened him more. If a man shouted at you, you knew where he stood. Silence left endless space for worst-case visions. Joe replayed his past decisions again and again in his mind, searching for anything that might have given real cause for a death sentence from above. He could find no moment where he had spoken to authorities before his arrest, no deal, no secret approach. Still, the feeling of being targeted would not lift. On the night of the 22nd of June 1962, tension inside him finally broke. The day had been like many others. Work, chow, the noise of other inmates pressing in. He had been moved to a different part of the institution, away from some of the familiar faces he had watched for protection as much as company. In his new setting, he noticed a man he did not recognize well, thin and quiet, moving in ways that, to his strained eyes, seemed deliberate. Later, he said he believed this man was one of 3 people sent to carry out the contract on him. He told investigators that movements, glances, and circumstances convinced him that this prisoner was waiting for the right moment to strike. Whether those signs existed as he described them, or whether his fear sharpened ordinary gestures into threats, is something only he knew for certain. In a moment of panic and grim resolve, he decided to act first. Armed with a simple metal tool, picked up in a work area, a piece of steel that had no clear place in a seal.lurg cell block. He followed the man into a less crowded space and attacked. The struggle was brief. Other prisoners shouted. Guards rushed in. Whistles blew. The man he struck collapsed. Medical staff arrived, but their efforts could not reverse what had been done. The prisoner, a middle-aged man named John Sopp, died from his injuries. In the stark light of the aftermath, the picture shifted. Authorities explained to Joe that Sopp was not a hired killer, not a member of organized crime at all, but an inmate serving time for unrelated offenses. If a contract on Joe existed, this man had nothing to do with it. Whatever danger might have been real or imagined, Sopp wasn't part of it. Prison officials locked Joe down, then moved him under tight guard. A federal grand jury indicted him for murder. Once again, he faced the machinery of the justice system, this time with even fewer cards in his hand. The killing had taken place in a controlled environment, with multiple witnesses. He had been caught immediately. There were no plausible arguments about mistaken identity in the legal sense. No doubt that he had delivered the blows. His lawyers understood the situation. A full trial on a first-degree charge could end with a death sentence. Facing that risk, Joe chose to plead guilty to a lesser degree of homicide. The court accepted his plea and imposed a life sentence to be served after his existing term for the narcotics conviction. Effectively, any realistic hope of leaving prison alive was stripped away. In the isolation that followed, something inside him shifted. For decades, he had told himself that his sacrifices, time in jail, risks taken on the street were balanced by the support and protection of the organization he served. Now he believed that those very people had marked him for death, based on nothing more than suspicion and the words of others. He had spent his life following orders, and in his mind, they had repaid him by making him a target in a place where he had almost no defense. That sense of betrayal dug deep, anger mixed with fear and a growing realization. Whatever the code demanded, it had not saved him. Instead, it had cornered him. If he kept quiet, he faced the rest of his days behind bars, always watching his back for a blade or a beating arranged by men he had once called his own. If he spoke, he would break an oath he had long considered sacred, but he might finally tilt the balance in his own favor. The first approaches between Joe and the government did not unfold in a single dramatic moment. There was no cinematic scene where he slammed his fist and declared he would talk. It began with guarded conversations. Prison officials saw that he was frightened. They had also read reports about his long history with New York's underworld. Somewhere in the chain, someone understood that this man, trapped and resentful, might be willing to open up. Agents from federal investigative units, including the FBI and the Bureau of Narcotics, started visiting him under careful arrangements. At first, he held back, as habit demanded. He had spent his whole adult life refusing to answer questions from authorities about anything beyond the most basic facts. The words, "I don't know," and "I wasn't there," had almost become reflexes. Gradually, he tested the new path. He offered small pieces of information that were already suspected or partially known. The names of certain bosses, the fact that different cities groups coordinated through committees, the internal titles used: boss, underboss, counselor, captains, soldiers. When nothing terrible happened to his family on the outside as a direct response, and when authorities responded with protection instead of threats, he edged forward. He described the induction ceremony, how a finger was pricked, how a holy image was burned in his palm as he repeated a pledge. For years, law enforcement had heard rumors about such rites, but never from a man who had stood in the room as it took place. That detail alone caught the attention of senior officials in Washington. The more he talked, the more agents pressed. They wanted structure, how many families there were, who led them, how they settled disputes, how meetings like the one at Apalachen fit into the bigger picture. He explained the existence of a body he called the Commission, a council where top bosses met to coordinate policies and avoid wars like the one he had lived through in the early 1932. To listeners who had spent careers trying to prove that such a national body existed, his words were like pieces of a puzzle finally dropping into place. Still, he held back certain things at first, instinctively protecting individuals he felt had treated him fairly. Old loyalties did not vanish overnight, yet every step deeper into cooperation marked him as something new in the eyes of his former world. Not just a prisoner who might be killed, but a potential informer whose very existence posed a danger to them. As word of his talks leaked within official circles, higher-level decisions took shape. The Senate had been conducting investigations into organized crime for more than a decade. Hearings in the early 1950s had exposed glimpses of the underworld but still left many questions unresolved. Now, in the early 1960s, another committee saw a chance to present to the public a witness who could tie together names, places, and structures with the authority of someone who had lived inside them. Justice Department officials, including Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, were briefed on Joe's willingness to testify. They weighed the risks. On one side, putting a man like him on the stand would shatter once and for all the official denials that a coordinated criminal network existed. On the other, skeptics could question his credibility as a lifelong lawbreaker now speaking in exchange for protection. Negotiations shaped the terms. Joe wanted protection for himself and some assurance for his immediate family. He wanted to avoid execution for the prison killing. Prosecutors held the power to influence those outcomes. In return, they demanded full disclosure. Names, dates, responsibilities, and a clear account of his own crimes, not just accusations against others. Piece by piece, he laid out his history, He spoke of truck hijackings and warehouse robberies in his youth, of acts of violence carried out at his superiors' orders, of participation in at least a handful of killings and knowledge of many more. He admitted his role in gambling rings, loan sharking, extortion schemes, and involvement, however limited he had once tried to convince himself, it was in narcotics operations that had spread misery through neighborhoods, like the one where he had grown up. Writing everything down became part of the process. Under government supervision, he worked with officials to prepare long statements, nearly a personal chronicle of his life and crime. Later, a journalist named Peter Moss would sit across from him for hours, shaping additional material into a book manuscript. For now, the focus stayed on official reports. Documents, prosecutors, and senators could study to prepare questions, build cases, and challenge his memory where it seemed shaky. There were moments when the old code tried to reclaim him. After a long interview, he would return to his cell and stare at the wall, thinking of the men he was naming. Some dead, some still walking free. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with many of them, shared meals and risks. Memories of laughter on street corners and quiet talks in parked cars pushed against the reality that those same men, he believed, had been ready to see him die alone in a prison yard. He argued with himself in the silence of his bunk. One side repeated the warnings he had heard as a young initiate, that anyone who talked to the government deserved the harshest punishment, that such a person was lower than any enemy. The other side answered that the men who had preached that rule had broken their own promises to protect him, choosing suspicion and a whispered death sentence instead. In the end, the decision came down to something simple. He did not want to die at someone else's convenience. If his voice could buy him a measure of safety and, in his mind, repay some of the harm he had helped cause over the years, he would use it. It was a rationalization, perhaps, but it allowed him to walk into each interview room without freezing. By mid-1963, plans for his public appearance were far along. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations scheduled hearings. Security arrangements were laid carefully. He would be moved under guard, kept separate from other inmates, shielded as much as possible from any attempt to reach him. Television crews prepared their equipment. Reporters cleared space in their notebooks. The man who had once seen himself as nothing more than a dutiful soldier from East Harlem, destined to live and die in the shadows, was about to sit under blazing lights before senators and cameras, telling a story that would change the way the country understood the hidden world he had served for so long. The morning they took him out of his regular cell, he knew this day would not be like any other. Guards came earlier than usual, their movements more careful, their voices lower. One handed him clothes that felt strange to fingers used to prison denim. A plain, dark suit, stiff, white shirt, tie. As he dressed, the knot at his throat seemed to tighten more than any collar he had worn on the street. They led him down corridors he didn't know well, past locked doors and blank-faced corrections officers. Outside, an armored car waited, surrounded by federal marshals. Shotguns rested in their hands, not pointed at him but never far from movement. The ride out of the prison yard felt unreal. For years he had seen only fences, towers, concrete. Now, through the slit of a window, he watched the road slide by, trees and billboards and houses where people woke up thinking of work, school, errands, not of testifying about a secret society on live television. Washington, D.C. came into view with its wide avenues and white stone buildings. The Senate office building where he was headed stood solid and gleaming, a world away from the dim social clubs of East Harlem. Marshals hustled him through back entrances, up service elevators, along hallways where staff carrying folders stepped aside and stared, recognizing the guarded figure from newspaper photos. In a holding room, he sat at a table with agents and lawyers. Papers were shuffled, last-minute points reviewed. They reminded him to speak clearly, to tell the truth, to stick to what he had personally seen or heard. He nodded, though his mind kept darting back to another oath, taken many years earlier in a cramped room with a burning image in his hand. Today, he was about to violate that vow in the most public way possible. When the moment came, a marshal opened the door and gestured. They led him into the hearing chamber. The space hit him like a wave. Rows of seats packed with reporters and spectators, television cameras perched on platforms, bright lights aimed at the long table where senators' Saturday flashbulbs popped. People craned their necks for a better view. He, who had spent most of his life avoiding photographs, now had nowhere to hide. He took his place at the witness table, flanked by guards. A senator at the center, John McClellan of Arkansas, regarded him with a measured expression. To one side sat the committee's chief counsel, Robert F. Kennedy, his face sharp, eyes focused, a stack of notes in front of him. An aide administered the oath. Joe raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. He spoke into a microphone for the first time in his life. His voice came out thinner than he liked at first, with that East Harlem accent he had carried since boyhood. Reporters bent over notepads to catch every word. Television audiences across the country watched from living rooms, schools, even barbershops, curious to see the man the papers called the first real insider to break the code. Questions began with his background, where he was born, when he left school, how he entered petty crime. He answered more calmly as he settled into the chair. These were events he had gone over many times with agents. Childhood poverty, street corners, the early jail term in Sing Sing, the natural slide from small thefts to more organized work. He told it in plain language, almost like someone reciting a long, unhappy memory to a doctor. The committee soon moved to what they most wanted, the hidden structure. Kennedy leaned closer. "What is the name of this organization?" he asked. Joe hesitated a moment. On the street they had used different expressions. Our thing, this thing of ours, the life. Saying the term out loud into a microphone felt like crossing a line no one had crossed before. "We call it Cosa Nostra," he replied, his tongue bending the Italian words into his own rhythm. There was a murmur in the room. Senators exchanged glances. For years, officials had argued over whether a nationwide Italian-American organization even existed. Now a man who had worn its ring of silence for decades named it under oath. Bit by bit, he laid out the hierarchy. At the top of each group, he said, sat a boss, unquestioned head of a family. Below him, an underboss helped oversee operations. A counselor, or consigliere, advised the boss, sometimes serving as a neutral voice in disputes. Beneath them, captains, capos, each rooted in a particular neighborhood or activity, supervised crews of soldiers. At the bottom, associates, men who worked with the group but had not taken the initiation oath. He explained that members, the made men, had to be of Italian descent and, in his time, usually from certain regions or with certain family ties. The ceremony that brought a man into full membership, he told them, involved a promise of loyalty sealed with a small cut, a burning image, and words that made clear the seriousness of breaking silence. He described how they were told that family came first, that disputes between members had to be handled through internal channels, not through outside institutions. The senators pressed him on the broader picture. "Is there one man who runs all of this?" McClellan asked. "No, Senator," Joe said. "Each family has its own boss, but there is a commission, like a board. The heads meet when something big has to be decided, like taking off a boss or settling fights between families." He named some of the men he had known in high positions. Charles Lucky Luciano in the early years, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, even bosses from other families around New York, Joseph Bonanno, Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci as figures who sat at that level or sent representatives. He also mentioned leaders from other cities who had attended national meetings, carefully listing places like Chicago, Buffalo, New Orleans, as he remembered them. When Kennedy asked about the Appalachian gathering, Joe recounted the scene from his own memory. The country house, the expensive cars, the sudden rush through fields when troopers arrived. He explained that such a large meeting had been called to discuss business, territory, perhaps disputes, and narcotics policies. He made clear that this was not some casual party. It was a national conference of organized crime figures. The committee dug into activities. How did these families make their money? What did his own daily work look like before prison? He gave them a catalog. Illegal gambling cards, dice games, bookmaking on horse races and sports, numbers running in poor neighborhoods, high-interest lending to desperate merchants and gamblers, extortion rackets where shopkeepers paid weekly for protection, infiltration of unions and industries like trucking, construction, and docks. Bribery of officials and police officers appeared as another tool, used to smooth operations and avoid raids. On narcotics, he tried at first to cast his own involvement as minor, but under questioning he admitted he had taken part in arrangements to move drugs, collect payments, and coordinate with people above him. He repeated the pattern he had used in interviews with agents. Bosses publicly frowned on the trade, but some allowed or encouraged it behind closed doors. The money was too tempting. The most serious area involved killings and physical punishment. Senators wanted numbers. How many murders did he personally commit? How many had he witnessed? How many did he know the organization had ordered over the years? He did not recite long lists on television, but he acknowledged that he had taken part in multiple fatal attacks under orders, and that violence was a regular instrument for dealing with informers, traitors, or stubborn rivals. He mentioned certain incidents, eliminations of suspected spies, punishment for crossing territorial lines, revenge during the old Castellamares conflict, but avoided gruesome detail. The point he drove home was that nothing serious happened without approval. A soldier did not simply decide on his own to end someone's life. Such decisions rose to captains, then bosses, sometimes even to the commission if high-ranking figures were involved. He also showed the senators that their enemies were not untouchable supermen. He talked about weaknesses inside the families, jealousy, greed, fear. He described arguments over money, struggles for succession when bosses died or were imprisoned, secret deals that undercut former allies. In doing so, he stripped away some of the sinister glamour that surrounded names like Mafia in the public imagination and replaced it with a picture of flawed men who operated behind a shield of fear and silence. Throughout the sessions, Kennedy alternated between pressing hard and giving him room to speak. At times, the council challenged inconsistencies, pointing out when Joe's memory faltered or when earlier statements differed. At other moments, he let the witness run, knowing that a story told in full carried more power than a series of clipped yes or no answers. For days, the hearings continued. Newspapers printed transcripts. Radio shows replayed key exchanges. Television newsreels showed the slight, balding man in a plain suit describing secrets his world had always sworn would never be told. Reactions outside varied. Some viewers saw in him a rough kind of honesty, a tired man who seemed more resigned than triumphant. Others dismissed him as a bitter criminal, inventing stories to win favors. Certain politicians applauded his courage. Others worried that too much attention might glorify the very people they sought to suppress. Inside the underworld, though, there was near unanimous judgment. To his former associates, he had become the worst thing one of their own could be. An ATM, the mosty informer, a rat. Any old friendship, any sense that he had once been a solid soldier, was wiped away by the fact that he now sat under cameras naming names, tracing lines of authority, and admitting crimes that had never before been tied publicly to their structure. Rumors of a bounty on his head grew. Whether numbers spoken in hushed tones were accurate or not, the meaning was clear. If anyone could reach him, they would be rewarded. But reaching him now was much harder. After each day's session, marshals hustled him through back corridors, loaded him into secure vehicles, and returned him to heavily guarded quarters. He ate separately from other inmates, walked alone in small enclosures instead of open yards, and slept behind additional layers of locks. When the last day of public testimony ended, he felt a strange emptiness. For months, preparing and then appearing had given structure to his time. Now the lights were off, the microphones cold, reporters chasing other stories. He was just another federal prisoner again, except that millions of people knew his face, and thousands of men in the life considered him a target. The impact of what he had done, however, did not fade with the cameras. Within agencies across the government, analysts pored over transcripts, cross-checking his accounts with informant reports, surveillance logs, and earlier investigations. Charts drawn on office walls sprouted new arrows, family trees, city maps marked with territories, lists of companies tied to particular figures. For the first time, officials had a coherent picture of how the various pieces connected. J. Edgar Hoover, who for years had downplayed the idea of a national criminal organization, now had little choice but to acknowledge its existence. The FBI built special squads focused on Cosa Nostra. The Justice Department began thinking about new tools, laws that could address ongoing criminal enterprises rather than just isolated acts. Seeds that would later grow into broad conspiracy and racketeering statutes found nourishment in the details Joe had provided. For him personally, the months after the hearings brought a different kind of spotlight. Officials encouraged him to continue documenting his story, both for internal use and, eventually, for the public record. Under controlled conditions, he dictated long, detailed accounts of his life, from childhood to prison, Government writers shaped these into a narrative, typing pages that moved from small East Harlem apartments to smoky back rooms and prison yards. The idea behind these efforts, at least as officials explained it, was to educate, to provide a first-hand account that could warn others, assist training for law enforcement, and strip away any lingering mystique around the men who claim to live by a code of honor while dealing in fear and coercion. A journalist, Peter Moss, gained access to some of this material and to Joe himself under supervision. Over many hours, he listened as the aging convict repeated stories, clarified dates, and reacted to questions. Moss would later weave these conversations and the official manuscript into a book that carried Joe's name and voice far beyond Washington hearing rooms and FBI files. Protection and isolation, though, came with a price. Joe lived in a kind of limbo. He was safer from his former associates than an ordinary inmate, but he had fewer companions, less chance for ordinary conversation. Guards rotated. Fellow prisoners came and went. He often found himself alone with his memories. Faces of men long dead, street corners from the 1,920 seconds, arguments in back rooms, the sound of shots that had changed lives in an instant. He read newspapers when allowed, and saw his own name become shorthand. Commentators wrote phrases like, "since the time of Valachi," or "the Valachi revelations." He watched a society that had once preferred not to know about the underworld, now speak freely about families and bosses, terms that once had been edged around in whispers. At night, lying on a narrow bunk under the dim glow of a corridor light, he turned over questions that had no easy answers. Had he done the right thing? Was there such a thing as right, left to someone who had spent so many years enforcing the rules of an organization built on intimidation? He told himself that at least now the world saw what had really gone on, that perhaps fewer young men would be drawn in if they understood the cost. Yet he also knew that, out there, boys on street corners still watched shiny cars and respected tough reputations. He had been one of them once. Words spoken in a hearing room, no matter how widely broadcast, could not erase the pull of money and status in neighborhoods where both remained scarce. What his testimony had undeniably changed was the balance between secrecy and exposure. The shield of silence that had protected men above him now had cracks. Future cases would pry at those openings, using his map of the organization to pressure new witnesses. Some of the very men he had named would, in later years, face charges strengthened by the framework he had helped the government understand. He, however, remained behind bars, moving through the slow routines of institutional life, while the storm he had unleashed continued outside. The boy from East Harlem, who once thought his name would never appear on more than a police blotter, had become, for better or worse, the voice that first told America how Cosa Nostra truly worked. When the last camera was packed away and the hearing room emptied, they drove him not back to the old cell block he'd known, but to a different part of the federal system. From then on, he lived in a strange middle space, too valuable and too hated to be left among ordinary inmates, too marked to ever again walk unseen in any city he knew. Guards escorted him through transfer after transfer. Steel doors, chain-link fences, the same sharp smell of disinfectant and dust, but always with extra keys, extra checks, extra eyes on him. In some places, they kept him in a small unit by himself, or with one or two carefully chosen prisoners who had no ties to his past. When he walked to the yard, it was often alone, under watch. The same organization that had once promised him protection now had men who, if they could get close, would see a benefit in ending his life. The government that had once been his enemy was now the only shield he had. Not long after the hearings, Justice Department officials came to him with a proposal. They wanted his story in full, everything, from his first days as a street thief to the moment he decided to cooperate. They had the transcripts of his testimony, but those were fragments, shaped by the narrow path of questions and answers. What they asked for now was a continuous account, something agents and prosecutors could study and learn from. In a quiet room with a guard at the door, he sat at a table while a government stenographer waited, fingers above the keys. He started at the beginning again. Childhood in East Harlem. The cold winters in the tenement. The first stolen apple. He moved through the small gang days, the Minutemen robberies where they took trucks and warehouse goods, the first arrest and the burn of Sing Sing's gates closing behind him. As he talked, he had to relive the choices that followed. Hiring out his muscle, shaking down shopkeepers, collecting from gamblers who couldn't face their losses. He named crews and bosses, but now he also lingered on small details that had not fit into the fast pace of the hearings. The way a certain captain always wore the same hat, the smell of cigars in Reina's Bronx hangouts, the nerves before early assignments that had involved serious harm. He described the years under Maranzano, the bloody transition that put Luciano's system in place, the formal ceremony that made him a full member, the long list of deals tied to horse rooms and card dens. He told of men beaten at his hands or under his orders when debts went unpaid, of targets driven in cars to lonely spots and not brought back. He was careful with the worst episodes, speaking plainly, but without vivid description. There were no raised voices in that little room. No drama, just a tired man admitting, one event at a time, how much damage he had helped deliver. He spoke of extortion circuits that stretched from Harlem to the Bronx, bar owners who paid dues because the alternative was broken furniture and empty rooms, union officials who took envelopes so that certain trucking firms or contractors won bids, while others never had a chance. He explained how collections climbed up the chain, a portion to the captain, a portion to the boss, with each level expecting regular tribute. He didn't spare himself. His own cut, he said, had fed his family, yes, but it had also fed his betting habit, his trips to the track where he usually walked away empty-handed. In retelling his involvement with narcotics, he sometimes grew defensive, insisting he was a small piece, that men above him had allowed or encouraged the trade while pretending otherwise. Yet he couldn't deny that he had moved money and messages that made drug shipments possible, or that he knew the misery such trade brought into the same neighborhoods where he'd grown up. The process took months. Pages piled up in government files. Out of that stack, officials eventually fashioned a long manuscript, sometimes called his memoir, though it was really more a statement than a literary work. Blunt, repetitive in places, but rich with names and timelines. It was meant at first for internal use, a teaching tool for agents who might never sit across a table from such a man themselves. Word of the document's existence leaked. Reporters and publishers sensed a story the public would buy, the inside tale, told by the first trader to break the old code. Negotiations and arguments followed inside government departments about whether any of it should be made public. Some feared that printing it would turn a criminal into a celebrity. Others believed a broad audience needed to see the life stripped of myth. In the end, an outside writer, Peter Moss, received access to Joe under strict controls. He also drew from the government manuscript, though he faced rules about what he could quote directly. Sitting in visitor rooms and small interview spaces, he listened as the aging convict went over his story yet again. Sometimes Joe repeated scenes just as he had told them to agents. Other times, he adjusted details, added an angle, or softened his role. Memory and self-protection tangled. Moss was no prosecutor. He asked different questions. How did it feel to wait in a car while others went inside on a job? What went through his mind before his first killing? Did he ever think of walking away? Joe answered as best he could, though habit still led him to dodge the most piercing parts of such questions. He would say that a soldier followed orders, that fear was always there but had to be swallowed, that once you were in deep, there was no safe out. The book that grew from these talks, combined with official material, would become known as the Valachi Papers. When bits of the story began appearing, even before full publication, they stirred new waves of commentary. Headlines used his name almost like a brand. He flipped through clippings when he could, seeing photos of his younger self paired with those of the older man in prison clothes. An odd feeling came with that. He had spent much of his life trying not to leave tracks, avoiding publicity, keeping his name out of the papers. Now the secrecy was gone, and what remained a thin, gray-haired man was being held up as the emblem of everything his former world had tried to hide. He didn't become rich from the book. Whatever small allowances or arrangements were made inside the system did not add up to the kind of money he had once moved on the street. New rules about criminals profiting from their tales also began to appear, partly in reaction to cases like his. Lawyers argued, families protested, but fortune never really shifted his way. Fame, he discovered, did not guarantee comfort, especially not behind bars. The emotional cost of his choice pressed harder as the years rolled on. He heard, now and then, reports about what his old associates said. Some cursed him as the lowest kind of traitor. Others claimed he had exaggerated, that he had pulled men into stories who didn't belong there. A few, in rare moments, admitted that he had simply dragged into daylight what many already suspected. None of that changed his status in their eyes. Once you talked, you were out forever, with no path back. He worried constantly about his family. His wife had lived for decades within the orbit of his world, benefiting from the money he brought home but rarely asking too many questions. Now she had to live with the weight of his new reputation. Their children, grown or close to it by the time he testified, faced whispers and stares whenever his name flashed on a screen. Government agencies offered some measures of help, watching over them more carefully, advising them if any danger seemed near. Still, he knew that young hotheads on the outside sometimes tried to show they were serious by going after relatives of informers. That thought gnawed at him. The isolation inside took its toll as well. In ordinary cell blocks, men formed friendships, for good or ill. They played cards, traded stories, argued about sports. In his protected settings, there was far less of that. For long stretches, he had only books, newspapers, and his own thoughts for company. Guards and staff kept a professional distance. Some treated him with politeness, others clearly disliked him, not just for his crimes, but for the fact that he had broken the street code and then become famous for it. His health, never strong, began to slip. Years of prison food, limited exercise, and the constant stress of looking over his shoulder had done damage. He developed heart problems and other ailments that sent him to the prison infirmary more and more often. Doctors adjusted his diet where they could, prescribed pills, told him to rest. Rest, though, was hard to find for someone whose mind chewed constantly on old scenes and future worries. At one point in the mid-1960 seconds, the weight of it all nearly pushed him over the edge. Reports from that time describe him trying to take his own life in his cell, an act stopped by quick-moving guards who found him in time. Afterward, he was watched even more closely. The attempt showed how deep his despair had sunk. He had traded one kind of death sentence at the hands of his former comrades for another sort of endless confinement, and in his darker hours, he saw little difference. Still, he kept going. Routine, in its way, held him together. Breakfast at the same hour. Short walks in small yards. Occasional work assignments suitable for someone under high protection. Simple tasks, far from other prisoners. Some institutions let him tend small gardens, pull weeds, feel soil crumble under his fingers. Those quiet minutes among plants gave him rare pockets of calm in days otherwise filled with cinderblock walls and locks. The law outside his walls shifted as officials built on the foundation laid partly by his testimony. New federal statutes targeted ongoing criminal enterprises more directly, allowing prosecutors to charge leaders for crimes committed by their organizations as a whole. Witness protection programs took shape in a more formal way, offering future cooperators what he had only received in improvised form. New identities, relocation, structure for life after testimony. He couldn't benefit from such plans. His age and notoriety made that impossible, but he saw that his step had opened a door others would later walk through. In 1968, when Moss's book finally appeared widely, his name surged again through headlines. Reviews called the account gripping, disturbing, revealing. Some critics praised the way it stripped away romantic images of men of honor. Others argued that no criminal deserved so much attention. Whatever warnings his story might carry, he followed as much of this as he could from clippings and mentions in papers passed around inside. A movie adaptation was soon announced. The idea that an actor he had never met would walk around on a film set pretending to be him struck him as almost absurd, a sign that his life had become something separate from the flesh-blood person who woke up every morning in a narrow bunk. He was moved eventually to the federal facility at La Tuna, on the Texas-New Mexico border. There, as before, he remained under measures designed to keep him isolated from anyone who might want to make a name by reaching him. The desert air was dry, the sun harsh. From certain spots in the yard, he could see the mountains in the distance, their outlines sharp against wide sky, a landscape far removed from the brick and concrete of New York. Visitors came less often now. His wife's health was not strong, and the trip was long. When family did arrive, the meetings were supervised, time-limited, overshadowed by rules and caution. They spoke about everyday matters, children, grandchildren, small events in neighborhoods he would never walk through again. Rarely did they discuss the old world he had left behind, or the hearings that had changed their lives. Some subjects were simply too heavy to lift in the few hours they had. In quiet moments, he sometimes thought back to faces that would never visit him. Men he'd grown up with, comrades from his crew, bosses he had once revered. Many of them were dead by then, felled by age, illness, or violence. Others were in their own cells in other institutions, serving sentences for crimes that, in some cases, had been pieced together using the framework he had helped supply. He also remembered, more often than he admitted to anyone, the nameless people caught in the wake of his crimes. The shopkeeper whose savings went into loan payments and never came back. The gambler beaten in an alley for falling behind. The families who sat at kitchen tables waiting for fathers who did not return from meetings arranged by higher-ups. In the rush of younger years, he had filed such things under business, just part of the life. Age and distance stripped away some of that armor. He knew he could not undo what he had done. There was no grand redemption waiting, no way to balance the ledger. At best, he hoped that the picture he had given the public might keep a few kids from choosing the path he had chosen. Whether that hope had weight, he couldn't be sure. He remembered too clearly how, as a boy, he had looked at sharper dressed men with full pockets and seen only the surface, not the prisons and graves waiting at the end. On the 3rd of April 1971, his time ran out. In the medical unit at La Tuna, his heart, already worn and damaged, failed. Staff worked to keep him alive, but the years had taken their toll. There was no dramatic last statement recorded, no final attempt to sum up his life. He simply slipped away as countless other inmates had, another number in institutional reports. Though his name carried a weight, theirs did not. He was 67 years old, still under federal custody when he died. Arrangements were made quietly. There were no big crowds at his burial, no public displays. His passing made brief notes in newspapers. Informant, Mafia turncoat, key witness against organized crime. For most people, his story had ended years earlier, with the televised hearings and the book that followed. The man himself had spent that final stretch largely unseen. His legacy, however, did not vanish with him. Inside law enforcement agencies, his testimony remained a touchstone, a starting point for understanding how Cosa Nostra functioned. Every time a prosecutor mapped out a family structure in court, every time a training manual sketched a hierarchy of boss, underboss, consigliere, and captains, echoes of his words lived on. When new witnesses came forward in later decades, they walked a trail he had helped cut, for good or ill. In the neighborhoods where he had once walked as a boy and as a soldier, life went on. New generations grew up on the same streets. Some found straight work, some hustled, some were drawn into updated versions of the rackets he had served. The names of bosses on the corners changed. The game, in many ways, remained. If there was a lesson in his long, crooked path, it was not a simple one. He had been both perpetrator and, later, accuser. A man who upheld a brutal code for most of his life, and then shattered it when he felt that same code had turned on him. He had committed serious crimes, robberies, assaults, extortion, participation in killings and drug conspiracies, and then spent his last decade explaining those very acts to the people charged with fighting them. Some saw him as a coward who only talked when afraid. Others viewed him as a crucial, if deeply imperfect, witness whose choices helped the country finally admit what was happening just beyond the reach of streetlights. He was, in truth, both things at once. A flawed man, shaped by poverty and pride, who stepped willingly into a violent world, served it faithfully, and then, when that world seemed about to swallow him, turned and spoke. From the cramped tenement rooms of East Harlem to a guarded cell in a desert prison, his life traced the arc of American organized crime in the 20th century. Its rise, its rules, its reach, and the slow, grinding pressure that finally began to push back. Long after his heart stopped, people kept telling and retelling his story, not because he was a hero, but because through his words, the hidden machinery of that world became, for the first time, impossible to deny. Years did not close the file on him. When the gates at La Tuna swung shut behind the hearse and his body left federal custody, paper stayed behind. Reports, transcripts, notes from late-night interviews, the thick manuscript of his own dictated memories, those remained in cabinets and archives. His voice, captured on tape and in print, went on speaking long after he was gone. In the months right after his death, most people barely noticed. The country had other worries: war overseas, protests in the streets, Political turmoil. Obituaries mentioned him briefly, usually with a few familiar phrases. Former Mafia soldier, government witness, Valachi hearings. Then the news cycle moved on. Inside government offices, though, his name stayed active. Young FBI agents who hadn't even joined the bureau when he testified sat in training rooms where instructors rolled carts with projectors to the front. On the screen flashed grainy images from the early 1960 seconds. Joe at the witness table, his hand raised, his mouth forming the strange words, Cosa Nostra. Instructors paused the film and pointed with sticks at diagrams, showing the structure he had described: boss at the top, layers below, the idea of a commission coordinating families. What had once been rumor was now standard lesson material. His interviews became required reading in courses on organized crime. Margins of photocopied pages filled with penciled notes. Check this name. Compare with informant X. Timeline? Even agents who privately disliked the idea of relying on a criminal's word had to admit that his outline matched much of what surveillance and later informants confirmed. In 1972, the story he had helped shape reached audiences in another form. A film adaptation of The Valachi Papers appeared, starring Charles Bronson as Joe. The movie mixed fact with invention, compressing decades into a couple of hours, turning certain events into cleaner scenes than they had been in life. On screen, his youth became sharper, the violence more choreographed, conversations more dramatic. Viewers who had never watched his real testimony met a cinematic version of him instead. The film showed ceremonies, killings, secret meetings, sometimes close to his account, sometimes not. People who had known the real man shook their heads at details that didn't match. But the general outline stayed familiar. Poor boy enters crime, rises as a soldier, ends up in prison, believes his own boss wants him dead, then tells authorities everything. That arc, whatever the artistic changes, had its roots in reality. His old world noticed. Men still active in Cosa Nostra hated seeing their rituals and slang turned into box office entertainment. Some dismissed the whole thing as Hollywood fantasy. Others, in private, cursed him again for ever opening his mouth. Even exaggerated scenes had started with his original decision to describe the structure. Without that first step, there would have been little for filmmakers to build on. Yet at the same time, the hard, practical impact of his cooperation went well beyond movies or books. In 1970, just a year before his death, Congress had passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. Lawmakers and Justice Department lawyers who had worked on that law had studied organized crime cases for years, including the picture that emerged from his hearings. RICO allowed prosecutors to treat ongoing criminal groups as entities, not just chase individual acts here and there. Instead of only going after the man who carried the gun or collected the envelope, they could now try to hold leaders responsible for patterns of activity carried out by their organizations. His explanations of how money flowed upward from gamblers and shopkeepers to soldiers to captains to bosses fit neatly into the kind of enterprise RICO described on paper. The names he had given of men in charge of different territories helped show that there really were structured families, not loose gangs. When, in later years, federal attorneys drew diagrams in RICO indictments showing charts of leadership and crews, they were following the same basic map he had laid down. Another long-term result of his case took shape quietly, a more formal witness protection program. Before him, deals with cooperating offenders were made in patchwork ways. A man might be moved to another prison, maybe given a different name on paper, but there was no national systematic plan. Seeing how exposed he had been, how much trouble officials had to take to keep him alive for the hearings, showed clearly that something more structured was needed. In the early 1970 seconds, the government created what would become the Witness Security Program, WITSEC. It offered new identities and relocation for those who testified against powerful criminal organizations, along with some support to start new lives. The details of that program rested on many cases, not just his, but the memory of what had happened around him weighed heavily in planners' minds. He had, in a sense, been a trial version of what later cooperators would experience more smoothly. While his body lay under desert soil, the organizations he had described in such detail kept moving. Through the 1970 seconds, Cosa Nostra families still controlled gambling, loan sharking, construction rackets, parts of the garment industry, and labor unions. Some bosses scoffed at the idea that one man's testimony could crumble what decades had built. They tightened their rules in response, stricter checks on who entered meetings, more careful talk, fewer large gatherings like Appalachian. They warned younger members again and again about the ultimate sin of cooperating, often naming him as the example never to follow. Yet cracks widened. The drug trade grew bigger and more chaotic. New groups, Latin American cartels. Later others took larger roles in narcotics, bringing fresh levels of money and violence. Traditional families either tried to stay clear or were pulled in despite themselves. The risks grew, and with them, new pressures on soldiers and captains. Long sentences now loomed for crimes that once drew only a few years. Under that strain, more men faced the same hard choice that had confronted him in Atlanta. Keep silent and risk dying in prison or at the hands of their own people, or talk and hope the government could protect them afterward. Each time one of them chose to cooperate, reporters and agents alike reached back to his example. Articles would say, "In a move reminiscent of Joe Valachi," or "Another insider breaks the code first shattered in the 1,960 seconds." The biggest legal blow to the old commission structure came in the 1,980 seconds in New York. Using RICO and years of surveillance, federal prosecutors brought a massive case against the heads of several New York families, accusing them of running a criminal enterprise that fixed construction bids, skimmed from concrete jobs, and controlled key unions. The trial became known publicly as the commission case. In court, charts showing bosses, underbosses, and capos appeared on easels. The entire idea that there was a commission of top leaders could be traced historically to information first laid out by him. Wiretaps now gave fresh proof, but the framework was his. When juries convicted those bosses, sending them to long prison terms, legal commentators sometimes pointed back to the 1,963 hearings as the moment when the country had finally accepted that such a body existed. True, organized crime did not vanish. It adapted, split, shifted into new areas. But the aura of invincibility faded. Before his testimony, it had been easy for defenders or doubters to say, "There is no such national thing. It's all exaggeration." After him, and the cases that built on his outline, that argument collapsed. He remained a figure of dispute among historians and criminologists. Some praised the accuracy of his broad strokes about structure and rules. Others pointed out mistakes in names, dates, or specific events. Memory, after all, is imperfect, especially when stretched over decades of fast-moving street life. Researchers cross-checked his account with other witnesses, police files, and wiretap transcripts. In most big themes, he held up well. In smaller details, he sometimes blurred. Still, one truth stood. He had been there, moving through wars between bosses, inductions, secret deals, and prison yards. Even when he remembered a year wrong or mixed one lesser event with another, he had given the public the first continuous, inside-out story of that world. Before him, knowledge came in fragments. A report here, a rumor there, an informant's tip with no wider context. After him, there was a skeleton on which to hang new information. Meanwhile, his image in popular culture settled into a clear shape. The archetype of the rat, inside underworld slang. His name became shorthand for betrayal. A young associate who asked too many questions might be told, "What are you, a Valachi?" Movies and television shows used similar figures. Older mobsters who flipped, sitting in secure rooms telling stories to lawmen. Many of those fictional characters had their roots, whether openly acknowledged or not, in the path he had taken. Outside that world, some people viewed him more as a kind of flawed whistleblower. They did not excuse his past robberies, beatings, his role in killings and drug deals, but they credited him for finally pulling away a curtain that had stayed closed for too long. To them, he symbolized the reality that even men who had lived deep inside a corrupt system could one day refuse to carry its secrets to the grave. East Harlem, the place where his life had begun, changed too. Waves of new immigrants arrived from different countries. Old Italian blocks became mostly Puerto Rican. Then more mixed still. Buildings were torn down or renovated. Social clubs he had known disappeared or turned into other businesses. Yet in old photographs, his era remained. Kids in caps on stoops, men standing 3 deep on corners near pushcarts and storefronts. that narrow world of early 20th century tenements that had shaped his choices so strongly. Police reports from later decades sometimes echoed the same patterns he had described. Different names, different faces, but the same hunger that drove some young men from part-time hustles into more serious crime. Poverty and tight opportunity had not vanished. The lesson he had hoped, in his better moments, that others would take from his story that the life ended in prison or death, not in steady comfort, competed with the more immediate charm of quick money and fierce reputations. If someone wanted a simple moral tale, his life refused to give it. He was neither a pure victim of circumstance nor a cartoon villain. He had chosen his path, step by step, learning from older criminals and then teaching younger ones. When those choices boxed him into a corner, he looked after himself the only way he could see, by breaking a vow he had once considered unbreakable. In doing so, he aided a system he had long scorned, the same government he had spent decades trying to evade. Yet that twist also fit the world he had lived in. His former bosses had demanded absolute loyalty, but, in his eyes, had shown little of it back when suspicion fell on him. The code he violated was the same one he believed they had already betrayed. From that angle, his cooperation looked, to him at least, less like treachery and more like revenge mixed with survival. Years after his heart stopped, debates about him still surfaced whenever another high-ranking mob figure decided to talk. Journalists would mention his case, law professors would point to his hearings as turning points, filmmakers would borrow pieces of his life for new stories. He had wanted, in his youth, to be important inside his narrow circle. Never could he have imagined that his name would instead be remembered mostly for the moment he stepped outside that circle and spoke against it. In the quiet of archive reading rooms, where researchers leaf through aging transcripts and yellowed stenographer pages, his voice remains. Not the rough sound of his actual speech, but the words, boss, family, Cosa Nostra, commission. Dry lines on paper now, but once spoken by a nervous man sitting under hot lights, trying to explain a hidden world to people who had never walked his streets. Those records, more than any film or dramatized retelling, preserve the real weight of what he did, both the long list of harms he had helped carry out and the late decision to reveal them. They are the trail he left behind, from the first small thefts to the last guarded interview, a trail that still teaches anyone who follows it where a life like his truly leads. Time moved on without him, but the country kept circling back to his name. It hung there in the air whenever people talked about the day the old code of silence had first cracked in public. In the years after his death, the noise of more recent scandals and wars rolled over the front pages, but in quieter corners, offices, libraries, classrooms, his story was still being picked apart, lesson by lesson. Those thick folders of interviews and statements he had given under guard did not gather dust. Agents used them as handbooks, prosecutors as roadmaps. New recruits in federal agencies, too young to remember when his hearings were broadcast, sat in training sessions where instructors passed around photocopied pages of his words. On the covers, in big type, was his name, Joseph Valachi. Inside were the tales he had first told in that Senate room and then gone over again and again in small interview cells. Long before his death, Justice Department staff had turned his dictated memories into a long, dry manuscript. It was not written like a novel. It read like a man talking in a flat voice about things that would have shocked his younger self to hear in the open. Officials argued over what to do with it. Some wanted to publish it as an official document so that the public could see, in plain language, how the organization worked. Others worried that putting a government stamp on the story of a lifelong criminal would cross a line, that it might even feed the public's curiosity in an unhealthy way. After much debate in Washington, they decided to keep that official version in government hands. It was used inside agencies, but not sold in bookstores. Years later, researchers using public records laws would finally pull copies from the files and study them in detail, comparing every claim he had made to court records, police reports, and the accounts of other witnesses. Their verdict was mixed in the small things and firm in the large ones. He made mistakes on dates, got some names turned around, but the big structure he described, the families, the chain of command, the commission matched what other evidence showed. Outside government walls, the story took on a life of its own through Peter Maas's book. Maas had listened to him face to face, then woven those talks together with the hidden manuscript and independent research. When the Valachi papers reached the shelves in 1968, it landed in a country already beginning to look more closely at institutions of power, from the White House down to local police stations. Readers sat on subway trains and in living rooms, following the path from a skinny East Harlem kid to a gray-haired man in a witness chair, realizing for the first time just how organized the so-called organized crime really had been. In that book, some readers saw him mostly as a betrayer. Others saw a man who had been used and discarded by his own side and finally turned his bitterness into testimony. Many saw simply a warning. No matter how loyal you thought you were, no matter how many orders you followed, in a world like his, you ended up either in a graveyard or in a cell. Looking back, the film that followed a few years later turned that warning into pictures. Charles Bronson gave him a harder edge, a different face, a different voice. But the outline was recognizable enough that anyone who had watched the Senate hearings could tell where the material had started. Moviegoers who bought tickets to see a crime drama might not have remembered all the dates and names by the time the lights came up, yet the idea stuck. There had been a code, a brotherhood, and one man had stepped out of line to describe it to the government. Inside the real underworld, his shadow lasted even longer. Old Dio timers who had sat in social clubs with him shook their heads in disgust when his name came up. Younger men who had only heard of him through others learned that one of the worst insults you could throw at someone was to call him a Valachi. It meant he talked when pressure came. It meant he had placed his own life above the secrecy of the group. At the same time, some of those same younger men eventually made the same choice he had. In the late 1970 seconds, a high-ranking West Coast figure named Jimmy Fratiano agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. In the 1980 seconds, Tommaso Buscetta, a Sicilian mafioso who had seen his own world torn apart by violence, told Italian and American prosecutors about the workings of Cosa Nostra overseas and its ties in the United States. Later still, men like Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Gravano, and others followed suit. Many of those later witnesses had never met Joe face-to-face. Some had only a hazy idea of his specific crimes. Yet every one of them stepped to the other side of that same line he had crossed. They chose to talk. Their decisions rested on individual pressures, fear, anger, survival, but their path had been cleared by his example and the government's refinement of how to handle men like him. By then, the witness security program could offer what it had not been able to offer him. New lives on the outside, guarded by formal rules and staffed units, not just by ad-hoc arrangements. The law, too, matured in ways that would have seemed impossible back when he first drove hijacked trucks and collected from card games. RICO cases in the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds broke apart the upper layers of families he had once looked up at. Bosses and underbosses he had named in his hearings were either long dead or in wheelchairs by then, but the structure they'd built took heavy hits. Trials produced stacks of tapes capturing their successors using the same terms, capo, soldier, making men that he had translated for senators and TV audiences decades earlier. Even as courtrooms relied on his outline, the wider world's picture of organized crime pulled in other directions. In 1972, the same year the Valachi Papers film was released, The Godfather arrived in theaters. That story, partly based on real figures but heavily fictionalized, painted a different portrait. Family honor, solemn rituals, tragic kings brought down by fate as much as by their own actions. People who watched it sometimes came away with a mix of fear and fascination, impressed as much by the dark glamour as by the brutality. His own account clashed with that romance. He talked about cramped social clubs with steam hissing in the walls, about cheap suits, about endless nights at smoky tables trying to squeeze dollars out of gambling addicts and small shopkeepers. He showed that most soldiers were not grand strategists or noble figures, but working criminals always on edge. Watching for police on one side, bosses' displeasure on the other. Over the years, authors and filmmakers blended pieces of both visions, the drab, tense world he described, and the more polished myth others had created. Somewhere between those poles lay the truth. To those who read closely, his version dug under the polish and reminded them how much pettiness and fear sat inside that supposed honor. Back in East Harlem, where he had first seen sharply dressed men step out of cars and thought they had figured out life, time did its own work. By the 21st century, the neighborhood had layers of history built into every block. A passerby might walk past a building where he'd once collected envelopes or stood guard without any sign on the wall saying what had happened there. Grocery stores stood where old cafes had been. Schools and community centers filled spaces that had once been social clubs with frosted windows and watchful eyes behind them. Historians and journalists sometimes went back to those streets with notebooks, wondering how much the place itself had shaped him. They talked to older residents who remembered when Italian, not Spanish, filled the air, when church bells marked the hours and children played stickball in the street. Those elders spoke of poor families and tight bonds, but also of the gap between legal work that paid little and the cash that flowed from men who weren't afraid of breaking laws. In that gap, boys like Joe had made choices. Not every kid took the same road. Many pushed through school, found day jobs, stayed clear of crews, but enough followed the path he had that it formed a pattern. That pattern helped explain why his story resonated beyond just his own life. It showed how crime could seem, to some, less like a wild rebellion, and more like simply the most obvious ladder available when other ladders were missing rungs. The arc of his years offered no neat redemption. He had not started a charity from behind bars, had not turned into a gentle wise man. He had simply told the truth as he understood it to those who asked, after spending most of his life doing the opposite. The harm he had done in his younger days lay there, unerasable. No testimony could undo the fear he had helped spread, or the lives distorted by the operations he'd served. What his cooperation did change was the balance between secrecy and sunlight. Before him, officials high up could still say, with a straight face, that they had no proof of any national criminal brotherhood, just scattered local gangs. After him, that claim collapsed. The words he spoke in that hearing room pulled the idea of Cosa Nostra out of rumor and placed it firmly in the record. From that point on, no one could honestly say they didn't know how that world worked. For people trying to fall asleep with his story in their minds, there is perhaps one quiet lesson to carry. The choices he made, step by step, were not shaped by grand ideas. They came from small moments, staying out of school to earn a few coins, following older boys on a risky errand, taking that first steady job from a neighborhood tough, agreeing to do just this one dangerous favor. Each choice seemed narrow, driven by the needs of that day. Only when he was an old man in a cell, looking back, did the whole crooked line come into view. If a young boy on a corner had asked him, back when he was still free and full of his own importance, whether the life was worth it, he might have bragged and said yes. In interviews at the end, stripped of swagger, he gave a different answer without quite phrasing it that way. He talked about waking up every day for decades knowing that, at any moment, one wrong word or one bad suspicion could mean death. He spoke about money that came fast and went faster, about gamblers' debts that never really ended, about always having to wonder if the man across the table was friend, rival, or future accuser. The boy from East Harlem wanted safety, respect, and enough cash that his family would never feel the hunger he had felt. The soldier he became found those things only in flashes, and always with a price attached. The old man in prison discovered that the only thing left that could not be taken from him by bosses or by the state was his voice. When he finally used it to tell how it really had been, he changed more than just his own fate. In the end, his life was a long warning wrapped inside a confession. It showed that a world built on fear and silence cannot stay hidden forever, and that even those who have walked deepest in the shadows may, out of fear or conscience or simple anger, one day turn and point back at the path they took. His words remain on those thin, rustling pages in archives, waiting for any curious mind to trace them and to understand that behind the old stories of men with power and code words were, in truth, frightened human beings making hard, often ugly bargains. Some nights, somewhere, a guard still wheels a cart of old tapes into a training room and presses play. A blackened and white image flickers to life. A small man in a suit, shifting in his chair, clearing his throat, beginning again to tell how it was. The agents listening may not know much about his childhood streets, or the smell of the tenement stairwells that raised him, but they hear in his flat, a matter-of-fact tone, both the damage he did and the door he helped open. Then the tape clicks off, the lights come up, and the world moves on. He is gone, his bones resting under distant soil. But the story of Joe Valachi stays, not as a legend to admire, but as a caution to remember each time someone, somewhere, thinks that a life in the shadows offers an easy way out of the cold. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Joe Valachi here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through secrecy, courage, and the life of a man who dared to reveal the hidden world of the Mafia. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.